Hey guys, welcome back to our next lecture on the Latin American Wars of Independence. Today we are going to talk about the causes of the war itself, which we've already been briefly touching upon. But we'll also get into some of the first major events, including what sparked those wars of independence and some of the major heroes that we will see emerge, such as Simón Bolivar and Father Hidalgo. We'll see these guys really start to lead their nations towards independence. So let's go ahead and jump into the notes. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Who revolted? That class that we have talked about that is fairly dissatisfied, although they were kind of the second, they really had a pretty good position for the most part, but it was all about social mobility. They did not have an economic mobility. They did not have the ability to have those top-level positions in the church and in the government, and they desired reform to allow those to happen. So for the most part, Creoles are going to be the ones that are upset about their position and spark these wars. The causes, though, of the war itself, social and economic are the main causes. You know, the strict caste system that we discussed, made it very difficult for people to have any kind of upward mobility in their lot in life, and so that was one of the biggest issues that caused people to want to revolt. And economics is tied directly to that. I mean, you were told basically what kind of jobs you could and couldn't have, and a lot of people wanted to have different opportunities than their parents had. So a lot of economic turmoil that led to revolution. The Enlightenment should not be discounted, and I know I probably sound like a broken record, but every ship that comes from Europe carries with them communication regarding these new ideas on how to everything from manufacturing to governments, how to challenge traditional systems with logic and rational observation. So the Enlightenment is a major factor in all these revolutions of challenging the way things had been done and trying to find a new and better way to live their lives. The next is a little bit more complicated, but to take you through a quick history lesson, the Habsburg line that had controlled Spain for years came to an end in 1700 when the Spanish King Charles II died. He had not selected an heir, and there were multiple families that challenged for their right to the Spanish throne, and it led to a war called the War of Spanish Succession. Not too creative of a name, but this war resulted in the grandson of Louis XIV taking over. His name was Philip V. He would establish the first in the line of Spanish Bourbons. Okay, the Bourbon family, extending back through the Louis, had been the ruling family in France. So this is the line of the Spanish Bourbons, where they take over in Spain. It'll begin with Philip V, but it will, of course, spread down throughout his children, his kids. And ultimately, we get down to an enlightened ruler his name was Charles III, who pushed a series of reforms called the Bourbon Reforms. The system we talked about in our last lecture, the viceroyalty system, was a highly bureaucratic, a lot of red tape, but there are a lot of layers of officials and bureaucrats that you had to go through. One of these, things that Charles was pushing was for kind of a simplification of the government process. And so the Bourbon reforms had multiple facets, but the first was political, where you had people directly responsible to the crown. You did not have to go through, the audiencias, the viceroy to get to the top. It allowed for local officials to have a direct connection through an intendante that had a direct connection to the crown, so bypassed a lot of corrupt bureaucrats. For 300 years, this system had worked in the New World, but again, with all that time, it had become corrupt over the period. So politically, it changed things. Economically, it changed things. It challenged the Peninsulares' rule in things like the Catholic Church, and so there's a big shakeup basically with these Bourbon reforms, and this would just kind of start to shift the foundation that will eventually lead to an even more violent spark. It's also worth noting the American and French revolutions served as inspiration. The people in Latin America followed the news, and they've seen that both in America and France, they've been able to throw off their their absolute monarchs in order to have a government by the people. And so, that is appealing to especially the Creoles in Latin America. So the revolutions both served as an inspiration. But perhaps more so than anything, what initially caused the spark that led to the wars was the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon is responsible for much of the history that's changing during this period. And basically, by the period we're discussing, Napoleon has taken over in France as he claims, kind of the embodiment of the revolution. That would be highly criticized, as he pretty much served as a dictator. Well, anyways, the Napoleon had invaded Spain as a part of the French Napoleonic Wars. By this point, Napoleon had really conquered most of Europe and had enforced what he called the continental system, which basically said all the countries of Europe had to trade within themselves. They could not trade with foreign powers, and namely this was to choke off Britain. They did not want European nations trading with Britain. Well, Portugal had long stood against Napoleon, and they basically said, no, we're not going to do this. And Napoleon decided to go basically punish them and force them to follow this policy. So he asked the King of Spain, who at this point was a descendant of Charles, and his name was Ferdinand VII. Okay, it's a big name. Write it down, because we're going to see Ferdinand VII pop up basically every single slide from here on out. Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, actually was somewhat friendly with Napoleon, invited Napoleon through, and they were having some tough times in Spain by this point. Ferdinand's father had abdicated the throne, so it's a very tumultuous time. Well, when Ferdinand invited Napoleon to basically march through Spain on their way to Portugal, Napoleon, being Napoleon, flipped the script and basically had Ferdinand placed under arrest, and put his own brother, Joseph I, on the throne. And this sparked a war within Spain as well. What had been somewhat of an ally, or at least they didn't really stand in his way, now all of a sudden was a tremendous roadblock. And Napoleon, this was a major mistake on his part. But the result in Latin America is what we're going to focus on here, because what this causes is everyone in Latin America to have to make a choice. Are you loyal to the current ruler, Joseph I, Napoleon's brother, or are you loyal to Ferdinand VII, the deposed king of Spain? And so we're going to start seeing some political action taking place in the colonies. And the first area we're going to focus on in this first phase of independence movements is Venezuela. Venezuela had a higher rate of Creoles than many of the other Latin American nations. I think part of that has to do with their geography along the northern border, a lot of merchants, a lot of trading with Venezuela. And when that 1808 upheaval happens, when Napoleon marches through, replaces Ferdinand VII, people in Venezuela are having this debate, who do we support? And although Venezuela would fairly be split, mainly between urban and rural, like a lot of times, especially in the cities, they tended to support Ferdinand, the ousted king. So if you support someone who's not in power, and you say you want to rule in their, kind of in their honor, they decide that perhaps this would be a good time to declare independence. And so we're going to see the first waves of independence come out of this result of Napoleon's invasion of Spain. In 1810, in the main city of Caracas, Venezuela, they will form what's called a junta. Okay, now a junta is kind of a local government. After all, there's chaos back in Spain. Who's really giving the orders? The system has broken, and the local leadership in Caracas said, we're going to form our own local government. You can see their flag there. They let it be known who they supported in this fight between Ferdinand and Joseph. And the Caracas junta decides that this is the time for independence. And so they select a young man. I think he was only about 24 years old at the time. He's a proven leader. He grew up he was born in Venezuela, grew up in Spain, was witness to even Napoleon's invasion. He fought against Napoleon there with the Spanish army. But they select a young man named Simón Bolivar, who will be our hero. And I always laugh every time. For those in our class, what you have pictured in the bottom right is the mascot of Bolivar, Missouri. Bolivar, Missouri is a small town, but they are known as the Liberators. And they got, man, what a great mascot. I love that. The Simón Bolivar big head there. It's awesome. Anyways, they select, the Caracas junta sends out, and I should mention that juntas were popping up everywhere. Very similar to what happened in the French Revolution, in which you had cities with those political clubs that really kind of became the centerpiece of that revolution, where people got together to discuss politics. These juntas start popping up all over Venezuela, and Caracas just happened to be the biggest, and of course people turned to that for leadership. Well, Simón Bolivar takes off for Britain. The goal for the Caracas junta is to send Bolivar to Britain to try and get foreign support for their push for independence. If they can get Britain on their side, then they would have perhaps military means to defeat the Spanish, who will, of course, eventually try to come and take their land back. Now, while Bolivar, and by the way, I should mention, Bolivar is going to be the main character throughout the rest of our notes. He is the leader, the George Washington of this movement. And, you know, he's a very, I don't know how you describe it. He's a very interesting character because, he has these tremendous and lofty goals that he's going to pursue, but ultimately, he's going to tinker with things like dictatorship, didn't really trust democracy fully, wanted a republic though, so, he was a very passionate man, we'll say that. Now, part of where he got his ideas was from this man, Francisco Miranda. Now, Miranda had been exiled to Britain, and he was a Venezuelan who had already been exiled because of his own revolutionary activity, pursuing independence for Venezuela earlier on. And he meets with Bolivar and starts to share some of his goals with Bolivar, which will eventually adapt them as his own. In particular, Miranda's goal of having a basically pan-South American nation, to where liberating all the colonies of South America and creating basically one gigantic country on the continent. That was Miranda's goal. Bolivar would somewhat adopt that goal. Miranda's a very interesting figure. He would eventually, he was a part of all these revolutions, the American Revolution. He actually met with George Washington and guys like Thomas Jefferson. He was a part of the French Revolution. He was in France at the time. He even met Frederick II of Prussia. This guy was everywhere, very well connected. And he is now returning back to his home country to lead a real independence movement, and it becomes very much the mentor for Bolivar. Now, the two men arrive with the support of the British, at least in name, back in Venezuela, July 5th, 1811. They declare the First Republic of Venezuela as having formed at this point. Now, like we learned in our American Revolution unit, just because one country proclaims independence does not make them independent. Remember, American independence was proclaimed July 4th, 1776, and the war wouldn't even come to an end for another 6 years. So it's a very similar story here. Okay, here they proclaim Venezuela as being independent. Wouldn't happen for a long time, spoiler alert there. And partly because the country was divided on who to support. You can see the map there. You got patriots kind of in the middle, and you have frankly, the royalists is, I think, the translation there. People that supported, a return to more absolute monarchy. In March of 1812, the Spanish finally show up to reclaim their area. Joseph is not going to allow his empire to crumble after he has just taken it, and so they attempt to retake Venezuela, and they do garner a lot of royalist support, especially in the countryside. Bolivar, they put up a good fight, but then something happens, and I'm always amazed by how natural disasters have a tendency to shape history, but this was absolutely one of those events. On March 26, 1812, there was a major earthquake, and it was absolutely devastating. Hundreds, if not thousands, I don't remember off the top of my head, of people died in this earthquake. Just absolutely tragic for the people of Venezuela. But a highly superstitious society, and many people thought that this was perhaps a message from God, that this earthquake had been caused because they were in rebellion, and especially when people people began connecting the fact that March 26th, that date sounds familiar. In fact, it was the 2-year anniversary of the Caracas junta being formed. So a lot of people took that as a sign. God does not support the Caracas junta, and therefore rebellion should not take place. And so you actually have a lot more people leaving the patriot side under Bolivar and joining up with the royalists. By July of 1812, you have another major milestone in this story. For Bolivar, he was crushed by this news, but his mentor, Miranda, had actually signed basically treaties with some of the royalists trying to bring about an end to this war. Bolivar was extremely angry, and I guess rightfully so. You know, the cause that both men had started, Miranda had betrayed it in his mind, and by signing this armistice and kind of giving in to the royalist forces. Bolivar would actually arrange for Miranda to be arrested by the Spanish, and he will end up dying in a prison. But Bolivar let him know that he had betrayed him and that basically he was going to get the last laugh. Bolivar he's losing his grip on Venezuela, and so he flees to neighboring New Granada, which is today Colombia, in order to escape Venezuela and basically try to regroup and try to come back another day. Well, that next day would come February of 1813, and here is where Bolivar makes his name in history well known. El Liberator leads the admirable campaign. He only has a group of about 600 men, not very many, that he invades Venezuela with, but very persuasive. And I say that you can see there how they're going to do this. The map shows, using the mountain terrain to kind of hide their motion towards Caracas. Each of these villages that they're in, cities that they're going through, they're adding men to their number, and primarily because, many of them supported them in this region, but for those that didn't, if you did not join them, they would kill you. So June 15th, 1813, Bolivar publishes a decree called the Decree of War to the Death, where he, the goal is to try and eliminate royalist support and neutral, people that didn't care, and try to get them on his side. Let me read you just a portion of this. Again, the Decree of War to the Death. Pretty violent language here. He basically said that if you were not on his side, that you could die, you would die. If you did not directly support the patriot cause, and this is a direct quote here, you would face certain death, even if you are merely indifferent. You can't even be neutral. You are either with us or you are against us. And if you are against us, you will die. So it was obviously a very powerful message. And by the time he reaches Caracas, he has about 2,000 guys with him. And he is able to take the city and force out the remaining Spaniards and Royalists. So Venezuela looks as if it is free. Nope. Even though the Spanish are gone temporarily, you have another leader rise up in the east, General Moreno, who challenges Bolivar's complete rule of the country, and there's some more fighting that takes place. Ultimately, though, Bolivar is successful and does lead to the establishment of the Second Republic of Venezuela. First one did not last too long, so they're just going to scratch that. This is the Second Republic. But the story, of course, doesn't end there. In the primarily royalist areas, where you had, in particular, a lot of laborers that were mestizo, that were, the lower classes, they did not feel that this rich Creole of Bolivar was going to make their situation better. So they turned to a leader named Jose Tomas Boves, and he led a group of what are called llaneros. They're cowboys. They were men that knew the terrain, were good horsemen, good shots, and he will basically lead in the southern part of Venezuela. This Boves will lead this army of cowboys, and frankly, it's very violent. I mean, it is there. There's a lot of pillaging going on. I mean, there's At this point, it's turned into class and race warfare. These men are killing those that don't look like them, and it's a very, very violent affair. Ultimately, Bolivar gathers his army and goes down there to defeat them, but the tables are turned. Shockingly, Boves is able to defeat Bolivar, and this is a shock to Bolivar, shock to the country. The Second Republic of Venezuela is being threatened, and Bolivar will end up having to flee to the country of New Granada. After an assassination attempt, he will then flee to the country of Jamaica, and then after Jamaica, he seeks refuge in Haiti, that we began our unit with. Of course, Haiti, the first black republic in the world, they get on Bolivar's side, especially when he begins touting issues like abolition, emancipation, and so they will hook him up with manpower, with resources in order to return to Venezuela and to liberate that country once again. It'll take some time, though. We'll come back to Venezuela later. The next country on our list is Chile. So we're moving to the southern part of South America. And much like the story in Venezuela, with a little bit of a twist, in Chile, a junta was formed in September of 1810. The group that formed this junta, they did support Ferdinand, but the National Congress that is formed really had a lot of different takes. You know, they said Ferdinand's the rightful ruler, which I think most people would agree with, but the political struggle that ensued was very divided. I guess the only thing they were somewhat unified on was that the fact that they should not be independent. They're not necessarily pushing for independence early on. They're kind of just trying to figure out their own thing in support of Ferdinand, but they are not pursuing independence at this time. But you had three groups that emerged: the extremists, the moderate, the royalists. So really what they're debating is how much authority this National Congress that they formed should even have. And so you have some infighting, and ultimately you have a leader rise up, Jose Miguel Carrera, and he will align himself. He was a very wealthy, powerful man. He will align himself with the extremists who want, which again, extremists here may not be the same thing as extremists today, but he's going to want to reform a lot of things. Extreme meaning a lot of progress, a lot of reform. And so basically they want everything just short of independence. Is what the extremists are pushing for. And they do seize control of Congress. This is going to begin a period called the Patria Vieja. And that period refers to the formation of the first junta in Chile. And this was going to be kind of the ruling, that period where him and his men are trying to lead. Basically, it's not independence yet, but they're rising up in the name of Ferdinand, trying to clear out the royalists. But the problem came from the north. The country to the north is Peru, and it was heavily royalist, the most royalist nation in South America. And when they hear that, of course, they got all this trouble to their north with New Granada and Venezuela, but when they hear that the country to the south, Chile, is also in rebellion, they decide to send their army down there, their royalist army, and they do end up defeating Carrera and threatening this royalist government on Chile. Well, there was another defeat and another name that we'll talk about later on. One of my favorite names. This guy was half Irish, half Spanish, Bernardo O'Higgins. And he will end up defeating the royalists for Chile, is a national figure, a national hero even to this day. And he will end up defeating those royalists, replacing Carrera as the commander. But eventually the royalists do return, and O'Higgins does end up losing in what becomes known as the disaster of Rancagua. And in this battle, O'Higgins is going to lose, and he is going to be basically kind of forced into exile. They will remain a royalist colony for the next 3 years. And during that time, Peru is kind of pulling the shots. Peru is going to be the big problem here, and in particular, we're going to see the next round of leaders really target Peru as being the source of a lot of the problems. Now, we've primarily been in South America up to this point. major populations in Mexico, and but a little bit different story. So we're going to turn our sights to Mexico and see at least the first wave of revolution and what happens there. One unique thing about this is that it begins not with a soldier like we've seen in the other areas, but with a priest, Father Miguel Hidalgo. He would live from 1753 to 1811, and he was a very well-read Catholic priest, and he believed, frankly, that all people should be free. He developed some what at that time would have been seen as radical beliefs, and he even said that if a government is tyrannical, that you should rebel against it. Not many people in positions of authority were actually pushing for rebellion like Hidalgo was. In fact, it got him in trouble at times. He actually got wrapped up in the Inquisition. They put him on trial, challenged his beliefs, but he was found basically not guilty. He was removed. Eventually, he would be removed from his parish, but he would be sent someplace else, which is a kind of twist of fate, because he would be sent to this town called Dolores. Now, in Dolores, there were some more radical thinkers, and he would help found a society called the Queretaro Literary Club. And basically, this was kind of like your political clubs in France. This was a group that talked about, revolutionary activities, and they got together to discuss. In fact, they ended up planning a rebellion, but the plans ended up being discovered, and it became known that basically the soldiers were on their way to arrest Hidalgo, to arrest the other leaders of this club, and Hidalgo decided, instead of going gracefully, that he would basically lead the revolution now. And so he ran back to his parish, and he begins ringing the bells of his parish, and this becomes known as the Cry of Dolores. Bells at this time, coming from the Catholic Church, signified a lot. I mean, that's how most people kept time, the bells. And so to hear these bells going crazy, all the townspeople came to the church in order to hear what was happening. There was obviously some emergency, and so Hidalgo addressed the crowd, and he basically said that now is the time to unite. He calls for all native peoples, all mestizo, all peoples of color to fight in the name of Ferdinand, to fight for equality, to be treated equally. This was the cry of Dolores, and what he basically calls for is a class war. Let's go ahead and he said he starts leading this mob of people, and he authorizes them to ransack houses, go to Peninsulares. He even allows his followers to kill Peninsulares. This is a full-on class war, and we're seeing a lot of revenge and a lot of bloodshed that's coming. Now, what ended up, he gained a lot of support and would continue that to support. I'll go through some of the numbers later on. The problem was this was kind of more of a regional movement than it was, a full-on national movement. And I mentioned some of these things already, but Hidalgo, as his men, they basically decide to start marching towards Mexico City. That's going to be the goal. Take the capital. The time for revolution is now. So he's pushing certain things like the end of slavery, enforced tribute by Indians, this taxation that they had to pay, just native peoples who were already extremely poor. He will denounce the caste system, saying that it needs to be done away with, and he does propose that Indians, native peoples, are given back parts of their land. So again, they are basically marching towards Mexico City. They're swinging through agricultural areas, picking up more and more people. Many Creoles even joined in. They did not like it when it turned violence, and so you do have kind of that split Creole support. I mean, this is a true class war that we are seeing. But it's growing. It's growing momentum with every step towards Mexico City. He began in Dolores with about 1,000 people. By the time a week had passed, his number, this mob behind him marching towards Mexico City, had grown to 25,000 people. And then eventually, by the time they reached the city, his mob had grown to 75,000 people that are demanding action. But then we have one of the craziest twist of fate, I guess, that I've ever heard of. And in fact, I don't really quite understand how to explain it. He has this massive army of people behind him. He has this momentum going with him. And when they get to Mexico City, banging at the gates, he decides not to take the city. They decide not to go in. I don't know if Hidalgo had a change of heart and realized how many people would actually die because of this. I don't know. I don't know why. But he stops at the gates of Mexico City, and eventually the mob, of course, disperses. The authorities end up arresting Hidalgo. I guess there was some fighting this January 1811. He is defeated. He's able to escape for a little bit, but is captured a few months later. And things do not end well for Hidalgo. He will end up being put on trial for treason, for trying to overthrow the state. And he is not just executed, but he is beheaded, and his head is placed on a spike, on a pike in the city for all to see. What happens to traitors. Things do not go well for Hidalgo. But the movement he sparks will be one that continues on. And we're not done with Mexico. We're going to see that there is another priest in the south who was a part of this that kind of broke away to try and rally people in the southern part of Mexico. And he will continue on, and he will have more success than Hidalgo did. I always wonder what would have happened if he had taken the city. We'll never know. But either way, next time we meet, we're going to talk a little bit more about Mexico. We'll talk about what is happening there and kind of the second overall phase of Latin American independence movements. Guys, thanks for watching. And please, as always, email me if you have any questions. And look forward to hearing your questions. Bye.